Hello. Get ready for a terrifying experience, where mystery and the supernatural meet in a true and disturbing story. In the darkness of the night, there are secrets that should not be unearthed, shadows that lurk in places forgotten by time. And those who dare to face the unknown may end up discovering that they are not as alone as they think. So, before continuing, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell, and leave your like. But remember, what you are about to hear may stay with you for a long time, haunting your thoughts. If you dare, follow me on this journey into the inexplicable. Carlos had always been on the lookout for a night job that was quiet and offered a bit of peace, away from the hustle and bustle of daytime life. When he received an offer to be the new night security guard for an old cemetery that was closed for renovations, he thought he had found the perfect job. The cemetery, with its ancient tombstones and majestic mausoleums, seemed like a tranquil place, shrouded in an aura of serenity. But he was about to discover that the peace he sought was far from what he had imagined. Carlos's first night as a watchman started with a sense of unease, a slight discomfort he couldn't quite place. The trees surrounding the cemetery swayed gently in the nighttime breeze, and the full moon cast a silvery light over the graves and headstones. Carlos made an initial patrol and checked the main areas of the cemetery, making sure there were no signs of vandalism or intruders. As he walked through the graveyard's rows of tombs, Carlos couldn't shake the feeling that the cemetery seemed eerily quieter than usual. The silence was deep, almost tangible, and was only interrupted by the occasional sound of a leaf falling or the scurrying of a mouse in the undergrowth. He proceeded to the office, where he would spend most of the night monitoring the security cameras and making notes. As the night progressed, Carlos began to notice a series of strange occurrences. First, the lights on some of the tombs started to flicker, though there was no apparent reason. Then he heard the sound of heavy footsteps, as if someone were walking among the graves, even though no one was in sight. He tried to ignore these signs and focused on his task. Around midnight, an alarm went off in one of the cemetery's sections. Carlos checked the camera feeds and saw that the area was empty. However, upon closer inspection, he noticed something disturbing. A grave had recently been disturbed, with the soil around it displaced, as if someone had tried to open the coffin. The grave's plaque, worn by time, displayed a name and a date, but Carlos felt a chill when he saw that the name was partially erased, making the surname almost unreadable. Carlos decided to investigate. With a flashlight in hand and his heart racing, he made his way to the grave. The wind made the atmosphere even more unsettling, and the flashlight's beam cast shadows that seemed to come alive. When he reached the grave, he saw that the coffin was partially exposed. It was empty. The sense that something was wrong grew with each passing minute. Carlos returned to the office, trying to calm himself, but the strange events continued. The lights on the cameras began to flicker, and he had to restart the monitoring system several times. As he did so, he noticed a new pattern in the footage. Spectral figures began to appear on the recordings, figures that were not present during his patrols. The tension in the cemetery was palpable. Carlos heard a low, disconnected whisper, as if someone was trying to speak to him through the wind. The whisper seemed to call his name and ask for help. He decided to follow the sound, believing that there might be an intruder or someone in real need of assistance. The whisper led him to an old chapel in the middle of the cemetery, a small and dilapidated building covered in moss and ivy. The door was ajar, and Carlos's flashlight illuminated the dark interior. Inside, the air was thick and icy, and the atmosphere was oppressive. Several ancient gravestones were arranged in a circle in the center of the chapel. Carlos approached, and the feeling of being watched intensified. He noticed that in the center of the circle of gravestones, there was an old book covered in dust and resting on a cloth. The cover of the book was adorned with strange and ancient symbols, and despite his growing fear, Carlos felt an inexplicable pull towards the object. When he touched the book, the shadows in the chapel began to stir. The ghostly figures he had seen on the camera recordings began to materialize in the air, with twisted faces of agony and suffering. The temperature dropped even further, and Carlos began to hear the desperate screams of the trapped souls in the chapel. He tried to leave, but the doors were sealed by an invisible force. The figures began to close in on him, their eyes glowing with a spectral light. Carlos found himself surrounded by the entities, which were trapped between the world of the living and the dead, seeking release. As the figures approached, Carlos read aloud some of the words from the book, hoping to find a way to appease the spirits. However, his words seemed to only intensify their torment. The figures began to scream, and the book started to glow with a bright light. The ground began to crack, and the chapel seemed to be disintegrating around him. In the final moment, Carlos saw a figure in front of him, the entity of an old watchman condemned to protect the cemetery forever. The figure looked at him with a sad and desperate gaze, and Carlos felt a wave of understanding and empathy. He tried to communicate, but his voice was swallowed by the screams and the growing chaos. The chapel collapsed in a crash of light and shadows, and Carlos was consumed by the darkness. By morning, the cemetery was once again silent, and the old book had vanished. Carlos was never found, and the spot where he disappeared became a place of legends and rumors among the locals. Some say that on quiet nights, you can still hear Carlos's screams and whispers echoing through the cemetery's corridors, searching for a way to find peace in a place where eternal rest has been forever denied. Lucas had just landed a job as a night technician in a recently renovated laboratory. The laboratory was part of a prestigious research institute located on the outskirts of town, in an area known for its old, mysterious buildings. Despite the lab's modern equipment and renovations, there were rumors among the staff about strange occurrences in the building at night. Lucas's first night started off with a sense of excitement mixed with a tinge of unease. The laboratory was pristine and filled with the latest scientific equipment, but it was eerily quiet. The only sounds were the hum of machines and the occasional creak of the old building settling into the night. Lucas made his rounds, checking on various machines and systems, ensuring everything was running smoothly. Around midnight, while he was in the storage room organizing supplies, Lucas noticed something peculiar. The lights in the laboratory flickered intermittently, casting erratic shadows across the walls. He tried to adjust the circuit breakers, but the flickering persisted. As he worked, he heard faint, echoing footsteps that seemed to come from the empty halls outside the storage room. Curious and a bit unnerved, Lucas went to investigate. The hallway was as silent as ever, and the only visible movement was the occasional sway of the building's old pipes. As he walked through the laboratory, the sensation of being watched grew stronger. The air felt heavy, and Lucas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He returned to the storage room, and as he turned around to leave, he saw something that made his blood run cold. In the dim light, he noticed a shadow moving along the wall behind him. The shadow had no clear shape or form, but seemed to be trailing his movements. Lucas turned quickly, but there was nothing there. The shadow vanished, leaving him more anxious than before. Determined to find the source of the disturbances, Lucas decided to review the security footage. To his astonishment, he saw a figure on the monitors that didn't correspond to anyone he knew. The figure appeared to be wearing an old-fashioned lab coat, and though its face was obscured, its presence was unmistakable. The figure seemed to be moving through the laboratory with purpose, despite the fact that no one else was supposed to be there. As the night wore on, the disturbances became more frequent. Equipment began to malfunction inexplicably, and Lucas started to hear strange noises coming from the laboratory's old storage room. When he went to check, he found that the temperature had dropped significantly, and a cold mist had settled in the room. The lab equipment, which had been working perfectly, now showed erratic readings and flickered on and off. Lucas was about to call for assistance when he noticed something alarming. The figure from the security footage appeared on the lab's cameras again, but this time it was approaching the storage room. Lucas felt a chill run down his spine. He decided to confront whatever was causing the disturbances, hoping to resolve the issue once and for all. He armed himself with a flashlight and cautiously made his way to the storage room. As he entered, he saw the figure standing in the middle of the room, its form more distinct now. The figure wore an old-fashioned lab coat and had a sorrowful expression on its face. Lucas tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat as the figure slowly turned towards him. The figure's eyes glowed with a ghostly light, and Lucas felt an overwhelming sense of sadness and despair. He reached out, trying to understand what was happening, but the figure began to dissipate into a swirl of mist. As it vanished, Lucas heard a faint whisper saying, "Help me." Desperate to uncover the truth, Lucas began to investigate the history of the laboratory. He discovered that many years earlier, a scientist who had worked there had mysteriously disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The scientist had been conducting controversial experiments that were shrouded in secrecy, and it was rumored that his research had gone terribly wrong. Determined to put the restless spirit to rest, Lucas began researching the scientist's work. He found old files and notes related to the experiments and discovered that the scientist had been trying to develop a technology that could communicate with other realms. It was believed that the experiments had opened a portal, trapping the scientist's spirit in the laboratory. Lucas performed a thorough investigation and followed the clues left behind by the scientist. He managed to piece together the incomplete experiments and, using his knowledge of the old records, performed a ritual to close the portal and release the trapped spirit. As he completed the ritual, the laboratory was filled with a warm, calming light. The next morning, the laboratory was once again peaceful, and the strange occurrences ceased. Lucas never experienced another disturbance in the laboratory. He was praised for his bravery and dedication, but he always remembered the ghostly figure he had encountered and the sorrowful whisper that had asked for help. The laboratory continued its work without incident, and the story of the ghostly figure became a cautionary tale among the staff. Lucas knew that the restless spirit of the scientist had finally found peace, thanks to his determination to uncover the truth and resolve the mystery. Claudia had always been drawn to abandoned places. There was something about the desolation and mystery that intrigued her. When she found out about an old deserted factory on the edge of town, she couldn't resist the urge to explore it. The factory, once a bustling hub of activity, had been closed for years, and local legends spoke of strange occurrences and disappearances connected to the place. One chilly evening, Claudia decided to visit the factory. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the overgrown lot and the crumbling building. The factory's metal gates were rusted and partially open, as if inviting her in. With a flashlight in hand and her camera slung over her shoulder, she ventured inside. The factory's interior was in a state of decay. Dust coated every surface and broken machinery lay scattered about. The once imposing assembly lines were now rusted and covered in cobwebs. Claudia's footsteps echoed through the empty halls, and the only sound was the occasional drip of water from the leaky roof. As she explored the building, Claudia noticed that certain areas seemed oddly untouched by time. Old office rooms still had paperwork scattered around, and some machinery appeared to have been left in a hurry. The deeper she ventured, the stronger the sense of unease grew. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the shadows seemed to move in the corners of her vision. In one of the back rooms, Claudia found a locked door that was hidden behind a pile of debris. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she managed to clear enough of the debris to pry the door open. Inside, she discovered a small room filled with dusty old documents and an assortment of strange devices. On a desk in the center of the room was an open ledger with cryptic notes and sketches. As Claudia examined the ledger, she realized that it contained detailed accounts of experiments conducted in the factory. The notes referred to Project Echo, a series of experiments aimed at creating a machine capable of manipulating time and space. The sketches depicted complex mechanisms and strange symbols, and there were references to transference and quantum displacement. The more Claudia read, the more she felt a growing sense of dread. The experiments detailed in the ledger seemed to involve opening rifts or gateways to other dimensions, and the notes suggested that something had gone terribly wrong. The final entries were scrawled hastily and spoke of unforeseen consequences and a breach. As Claudia was about to leave the room, she heard a strange noise coming from behind her. It sounded like a mechanical whirring mixed with faint whispers. Turning around, she saw a flickering light coming from one of the devices on the floor. The device, which resembled an old, battered machine with various dials and switches, seemed to be activating on its own. Suddenly, the temperature in the room dropped, and Claudia saw her breath fog up in the cold air. The whispers grew louder, and the shadows in the room began to coalesce into vague, indistinct shapes. The figures seemed to be moving toward her, their forms shifting and writhing as if struggling to break free from some unseen constraint. Panicking, Claudia tried to shut off the machine, but the switches were unresponsive. The device emitted a low, ominous hum, and the room started to warp and distort around her. The walls seemed to pulse and shift, and the figures grew more distinct, revealing ghostly faces that seemed to be pleading for help. Desperate to escape, Claudia ran out of the room and back into the main factory floor. The shadows seemed to chase her, and the factory's layout appeared to change, with hallways and rooms shifting unpredictably. She stumbled through the maze-like corridors, her flashlight flickering and her heart pounding in her chest. Eventually, Claudia found her way back to the factory's entrance. She pushed the rusted gates open with all her strength and stumbled outside, gasping for breath. The night air felt refreshing compared to the oppressive atmosphere inside. She looked back at the factory, which now appeared to be completely still and silent, as if nothing had happened. The next day, Claudia returned to the factory with the intention of documenting her experience. However, when she arrived, the building was locked tight and seemed to be in a state of complete disrepair, as if it hadn't been touched in years. The gate was shut, and the area around the factory was overgrown with weeds. Claudia was unable to re-enter the factory, and the ledger and strange devices she had discovered were nowhere to be found. The experience left her shaken, and she could never quite explain what had happened that night. The factory remained abandoned, and the secrets of Project Echo were buried within its crumbling walls, waiting for someone else to uncover the truth. Local rumors continued to circulate about the factory's eerie reputation, and Claudia's tale became a part of the legend. She moved on from her exploration, but she often thought back to that night, remembering the ghostly figures and the strange machine that had threatened to pull her into an unknown dimension. If this story touched you, leave a comment and share it with anyone you think would be brave enough to listen. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like it, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next stories. But be careful. The deeper you dive into these mysteries, the deeper you go. And sometimes the way back isn't that easy. Until next time, if you have the courage to come back,